So I think we have everybody here. We're really excited to end the day with Sendhil, Mullainathan, talking about algorithms and tools for equity and inequity. So again, thanks so much for coming. Thank you for all the papers, and we're really looking forward to Sendhil. So take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. I'm looking forward to getting feedback on this. This is rather than presenting one paper, I'm presenting sort of a collection of things. And so this involves quite a few collaborators: John, Jens, Ziad, Emma Pearson, and Ashish Rambachan. And a few papers I'll describe other collaborators individually. What I want to do today is just, for those of you, I mean, this is how slide decks get old. This type of stuff, I think now many of you may have already seen, but I just want to remind you a little bit why there's so much interest in algorithmic bias. So I went through some examples of the ones that sort of caused a lot of furor. This is one of the ones that I think did. If you type unprofessional hairstyles into Google Images, this is what you get. And you can see there's sort of a consistent pattern as to what Google Images represents as unprofessional hairstyles. And so this type of extreme racial bias baked into the world's largest algorithm, arguably, is kind of problematic. People have done this by doing things like, you can still do this. You can go search for, some of these they went in and hand fixed, but you can go and search for things like nurse, and you tend to find all women. And they fixed the CEO one. You could search for CEO. It used to be that you would find all men. So this is kind of one of, an example of the kind of things that bother people. Here I have the nurse example, you can see. And here's another one that kind of bothered people about how algorithms can create biases, or at least show biases. This comes from the world of word embeddings. For those of you who don't know, word embeddings are a commonly used technique in natural language processing. In a nutshell, what they basically do is they take the space of all words and map it into a small geometric space, a Euclidean space, through 300 to 500 dimensional space. Why this is interesting is that now think of each word as a vector. Vectors can be different. So, and those differences turn out to have meaning. So I'll explain what I mean. So suppose I take the word walking and I take the word walked. I take the difference between those two words, that gives me a vector. I can add that vector to the word swimming. If I take this vector and add it to the word swimming, I get a new point in the space. Guess what that point is? It's the point swam. So interestingly, these vectors, the embedding itself discovers structure in the space of words. Here's another example. If you take Spain minus Madrid, take that vector, add it to Italy, you get Rome. Add it to Japan, you get Tokyo. So these word embeddings are a remarkably interesting way of capturing the semantic content of words in such a way that their geometry actually has meaning. So that was kind of a great discovery in the NLP world. But soon after, people realized these word embeddings have a bunch of bias built in. So for example, if you take man minus woman and add it to king, you get queen. But if you take man minus woman and add it to physician, you get nurse. If you take man minus woman and add it to the word brilliant, you get lovely. So now, some of this is a bit cherry picked, but even with that cherry picking, it was kind of striking to most people when these results came out. Another common result, we just saw David talk about pretrial, and I'll be talking about pretrial as well. But one of the common things that was found is a very an algorithm compass that was used in pretrial, as David alluded to briefly, shows a great deal of algorithmic bias. And so this led to things like weapons of math destruction, this big data report. So it's fair to say algorithmic bias is an important issue that's really growing, and it's hard to open the New York Times without reading about it. It seems like that's their hottest topic. And there are questions that are being floated in the research literature. How do we know if discrimination is happening inside an algorithm? What can be done about it? How do we build algorithms that don't have bias? Should we regulate algorithms? How so? I've left some of the other things off. Should we even be using algorithms? Maybe we should be shutting them down. That's an extreme form of regulation. And so that's what I want to discuss today. Some terminology. I'm going to use the word bias and discrimination loosely for most of the talk to indicate what economists might often use to indicate as disparity. Here I'm following the literature. That is, I'm not necessarily going to tell you that disparity equals discrimination in the strict sense that a lot of economists might mean. I'm just going to use the word bias loosely. I'll try and it'll come out naturally. I think you should be able to read between the lines when I want to talk about base rate differences versus additional differences imposed through the decision process. But this distinction is pretty important, that in this literature, bias does not differentiate between base rates versus simply disparities in the decision process. Okay, that's enough for the present. What am I going to do? I'm basically going to tell 3 stories. I'm going to walk through 3 different experiences I've had working in this area. And each of them, I think, has taught me something, and I'm going to try and convey that. So I'm not going to go into as much detail in any one of these papers, but obviously in Q&A, definitely ask me any details, and I'll give the citations to dive into them. Plus the details are a little boring, and it's 3:30 in the afternoon, and I'm pretty sure people don't want to hear about them. Maybe they never want to hear about them, but probably not now, especially. So along the way, I'm going to try and informally state the results from a model that Ashesh has. And that will give you some sense of the intuitive things I'm saying come out of sort of a theoretical framework that I'll very lightly set up. Okay, so my main goal in this talk is an invitation, and I'll just state the invitation very explicitly right now. I think this is an important area. I think actually, as someone who has done economics in the past, I'm not sure anyone would accuse me of doing that in the recent past, but has been doing economics at some point in my life, I have often found other fields very interesting. But this is one area where I think economists, the economic tools, have an immense amount to contribute. In fact, if you ask me what's missing from the algorithmic bias literature, I would say it's economists. I think the empirical and theoretical tools we bring are particularly important. And in fact, as you'll see me build up, I think many of the questions that are sort of being danced around in this literature are ones economists have studied for decades. So this is an invitation that I think economists should get on board in this area. I think it's pretty exciting. Okay, so let me start with the first of these 3 stories. This involved work that I did so long ago that I think all my hair was black at that point. And this was when Marianne Bertrand and I sort of sent out resumes where we had randomized the name on these resumes to either be stereotypically white or stereotypically black. Now, what we found there was much higher callback rates for black resumes, okay, for white resumes, I'm sorry. So what I want to do is, that was a study 20 years ago, and that was a study that documented discrimination in the world, something like 20 years ago. I want to contrast that with a study that I did with some collaborators headed by Ziad Obermeyer about 2 years ago. And this was, again, a study finding discrimination in the world, looking for discrimination in the world. And this study involves something called care coordination programs. So what's a care coordination program? Basically, it centers around the following reality about healthcare. There's a set of people who have more than a couple of chronic conditions. So you might have diabetes and high blood pressure. You might be close to renal failure, as well as have obesity and a few. So it's people who have a bunch of things wrong with them. That's many chronic conditions can be read as a bunch of things wrong with you. And those people are actually super concentrators of costs. Health systems realize this. So realizing that they're super concentrators, they want to give extra resources. I'll give you a truly obnoxious metaphor, which people often use and which some people in healthcare don't like, but they use it anyway. Care coordination programs are like frequent flyer programs. These people are going to be going to the hospital a lot. And just like when you fly a lot, airlines have set up special lines for you. Same with people in care coordination programs. They don't go to the line at the ER that you go to. They show up, there's someone already there. They have a special phone number they can call before coming in. The nurse can say, hey, don't come in for that. Definitely come in for that. So they're kind of like gold status members, but at the hospital. Now, how do you decide who gets a care coordination program? Well, you don't want to be backward looking. You want to predict who's going to be using healthcare, who's going to need a lot of care in the coming months, in the coming year. So these systems need to target patients. To target patients, they turn to an algorithm. In fact, most systems use an algorithm, but the algorithm I'm going to be describing, or a variant of it, is applied to about 100 million patients in the United States. And so it's already at scale. So what we wanted to understand was, we have access to one of these sort of live private sector algorithm. And this algorithm has massive consequences for who gets into the program. And it's a pretty good program to be in. You're getting a lot of extra resources. So we wanted to understand what kinds of blacks and whites would be chosen for the program, and are there in fact any racial disparities? So what I'm going to look for is something in the literature called calibration, relative calibration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare, given the score that the algorithm assigns to you, that's going to be on the x-axis, how sick are you, that's going to be on the y-axis, and how does the relationship between the score and how sick you turn out to be vary between black and white. Okay, that's what I'm showing. That's the graph right here. Score is right here. How sick you are is on the y-axis is right here. These are the white patients. This is the black patients. At every level of score, black patients are much, much sicker than white patients. Just so you get a sense of the magnitude, let's choose a risk threshold. The sickest threshold, that's 97%. People in this above this threshold are automatically enrolled in the program. So it's a meaningful threshold. Let's look at the gap there. Blacks have about 28% more chronic illnesses at that threshold. And this is true of many other health outcomes. We've looked at various things. But the 28% doesn't, I think understates the extent of the problem. So let's do the following. Let's zoom into that area and let's simulate adding sick blacks and removing less sick whites until we get equity. That is, at the margin, let's equate this and get rid of the bias. Were we to equate this and get rid of the bias, we would more than double the number of blacks enrolled in this program. So just so you get a sense of the magnitude of this, this is not a small, this is a huge effect. It's as big as our resume effect. And in fact, it's as widespread, at least in the world of healthcare. So this was the audit study with resumes. This was the health algorithm study. What I want to now do is put them side by side and make some observations about these two studies, because I think it'll be illuminating about the nature of discrimination and disparity and discovery of that. So this is the racial bias of employers. This is racial bias by an algorithm in the context of healthcare. These are people doing it. This is an algorithm doing it. Okay, so I'm going to compare and contrast these two. So let's first talk about what it meant to uncover bias and how hard it was. In the audit study, I feel a little stupid putting the word cleverness here, but let's say that it was a complicated experiment. It was akin to a clandestine spy operation. You basically had to send out a bunch of resumes. You had to look for callbacks. Figuring out that there's bias going on here was this enormously contrived, complicated affair. And frankly, it's limited. We could only do it at this beginning stage of answering callbacks. If you want to do it at later stages, as people have done, it gets even more complex. Now you have to have individuals, hire them to be actors, send them in. And then, as Heckman has pointed out in some of his good work, it's not clear the actors are the same. Are they behaving this? You can't control it. You start to lose stuff. So the uncovering bias on the audit study was just a hard activity that you barely squeak by. With the health algorithm, boy, was it easy. Getting access to the algorithm is one thing, but given access to the algorithm, it was about as straightforward as a statistical exercise as you can imagine. Now, this is confusing because many people in the literature will kind of argue that, oh, algorithmic bias is hard to detect. It's actually very straightforward to detect in the relative sense. It's hard in the sense that anything statistical is hard, but it's straightforward in the sense that given the algorithm, there's a set of techniques you have to undertake relative to what it means to detect it when humans are undertaking bias activity. Now let's get to why the bias is happening. So we've uncovered it, let's dissect it. If we were dissecting the bias, I think it's fair to say 20 years on after this paper, we still don't have quite a great idea as to why humans, people screening resumes are biased in the way they are. We have there's been some really cool, there was one paper that was excellent that showed that people don't read past the name. And there's a bunch of indirect evidence that's very cool that suggests it might be implicit bias. We're not really sure. But let's see what we could do with the algorithm. So far, I've only shown you there's bias. Could we figure out what's going on? Well, to figure out where the algorithm is going wrong, I think we can actually look at where the algorithm is going right. So if I do the same exercise, x-axis, predicted score, y-axis, something, but instead of on the y-axis putting health, how sick the patients are, I put how much they cost the system. Look, the bias completely disappears. So what's happening here is that the algorithm is incredibly well calibrated for race, by race for health costs. And because whites have better access to health care and blacks utilize less health and cost less, An algorithm that's well calibrated for costs is biased for health. And the bias comes in purely from that. And we do some work where we show that actually, once you realize this, you can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can get almost basically the same amount of cost prediction, but without any disparity. And it just basically has to do with recognizing that when you're caring about health, but also caring about cost, putting appropriate weights on there allows you to both get very good cost prediction and not have racial bias. But the problem was the use of the label. And so once given access to the algorithm, figuring out the problem was also relatively straightforward. If we had the training data, it would be even easier because we would just look at it and see what they did wrong. But even without that, a little bit of detective work got to the answer. What about fixing the bias? Well, here is and there's been a few studies like this. There's a really good study recently out of a Berkeley team that reran the resume study. This is across over the last, I don't know how many ever years. And you can basically see that either the really big Berkeley study or this graph will tell you we've done zero, exactly zero, to change what our original resume study found. Nothing has happened. Nothing has changed. That's not a positive sign, but that is it. Little change 20 years later. Little is optimistic. No change 20 years later. On the other hand, what happened next with the algorithm fix is actually because there was a fix in the algorithm, it's easy to develop a method that reduces or nearly eliminates inequities at no cost, and that numerous health systems are now implementing and scaling up this algorithm. And that's the thing. It's hard to change software in someone's mind. It's easy to just install a fix as a piece of code. And of course, I'll skip this. Congress and states attorneys are working on fixing this thing. Okay, so fixing the bias. I'm not implying that it's not fixed, but it's on track. It's kind of a technocratic matter. It's a matter of political and policy will. So what I want to argue here is algorithmic bias is pernicious. It's very easy to creep into the system. It is very problematic because it happens at scale. Having said that, compared to human bias, the first lesson I took away from these two studies is when we compare it to human bias, we find that from uncovering to understanding to fixing, algorithms are easier on all those dimensions. So they're sort of as problematic as they offer a ray of hope in this thing. And this sort of says, once we're worried about detecting and regulating discrimination, algorithms can make our jobs easier. Okay, so that's the first set of studies. The second story I want to tell you about goes back to the topic David already described, which is pretrial. Let me just do this as a quick refresher. And here I want to talk about a category of problems. I think this category is exactly the category that all the work David described applies to. It's basically a decision maker who must decide who, for example, to hire. There's two groups of people, zeros and ones. One is the protected group that we worry there's discrimination against. You see some characteristics of this group. They have some productivity, some outcome, Y star, and you want to hire or undertake a decision based on your prediction of Y star, based on the W's that you see and the group status. So basically, a decision maker must predict Y star from W in order to make a decision. We've called these sort of prediction policy problems in which the decision depends on a prediction. The reason I find these problems interesting is they're ideal for machine learning, because ultimately, what does machine learning do? It takes a data frame with X's, in this case W, and Y's, and makes a prediction of Y from X. It's effectively using data to form a prediction. And so other examples besides hiring are credit decisions, pretrial, admissions, etc. But importantly, what I want you to notice is that this is a ranking problem. That is, given a set of candidates, you're trying to rank them based on their anticipated Y star, and inefficiencies arise from misranking. When people of lower risk, in the pretrial example, are jailed, but people of high risk are released, those misrankings will cause problems. As a result, these type of problems are excellent marriage with economic applications. A lot of economics is about the inefficiencies that come from misrankings. That's how we get inefficiencies in economics. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the second bit. I just want to flag, though, that everything I'm going to say excludes a really important category of examples. And in fact, it's a category that has not to my knowledge, been well modeled by economists, and in general, I don't think it's been well modeled, is representational harm. Here, the harm comes because the decision is being made and the algorithm is aiding in that decision. But you'll notice the Google image search, it's a slightly different kind of problem. There's no decision the Google algorithm is making. It's making a representation of who you get when you search for nurse. It's a different kind of harm, and it's an important kind of harm for a whole category of algorithms. It's not well modeled by what I'm about to tell you, nor do I think it's a problem it's been well discussed, but I don't know of any good models of this phenomenon. So that's just a caveat. Okay, so pre-trial, a lot of people are arrested in the United States. A bunch of them spend time in jail before their trial. The time they're going to spend in jail is very consequential. It can be as long as 9 to 12 months, often 2 to 3 months on average. The judge, in deciding whether you spend time in jail or spend time at home while waiting for trial, has one task. It matches exactly what we just saw. The decision is, by law, you have to predict flight and/or public safety risk. So in this case, Y is crime or failure to appear. And one of the things that we have to kind of flag here, that I think it was Dania who, hopefully I pronounced your name right, I'm sorry, who mentioned this. These variables themselves, crime or failure to appear, may be measured with some racial bias. In what I show you, we've accounted for that. We can discuss it, but that's a very important caveat here. Taking these as ground truth can prove problematic. What's going to happen is the judge implicitly forms a belief about Y and then decides on a threshold and jails if their perceived risk is higher than that threshold. That's the model. That's why it's sort of a decision predicated on a prediction. And what we want to do is compare how well this judge does to an algorithm. So what we did is, since it's such a clear-cut prediction thing, you build an algorithm to form the same prediction, and you ask how well does the algorithm do. So this is on the x-axis, we have the release rate. On the y-axis, we have the crime rate. Here I'm showing you the curve that the algorithm realizes. The curve is depending on where you set the threshold. So you set the threshold at very high, no one is released. Of course, the algorithm has 0 crime rate because everyone's in jail. Here's the crime rate you get if everyone is released, and here's the trade-off you get. So how well is the algorithm doing relative to the judge? Well, the judge is here. This is their release rate, and this is their crime rate. And you can see the judge releases about 73.7% of the people and has about an 11.3% crime rate. In contrast, at that same release rate, the algorithm ends up with at about an 8.5% crime rate. So about 24% reduction in crime. Of course, you don't need to go down the curve, you could go across. So you could have the same crime rate, but release about 40% of the population. There's a big caveat. Okay, so this just says the algorithm can beat the judge. As Jens likes to say, you can close Rikers in July. There's an aside here, which David discussed. There's an econometric issue that I think the machine learning literature often overlooks, but in the last couple of years has been good about not overlooking. In everything I just showed you, wait, how am I forming these counterfactuals? I don't actually have outcome data for those people who are jailed. So what do I do if I release someone that the judge jailed? This is an important issue. We call this selective labels. There's some, and importantly, there's work that shows these unobservables may interact with algorithmic biases. So this is an important issue. We've dealt with this a little bit in the paper, but it's an active area of research, and the results I described hold. I don't want to get into it for purposes of, it's not central to the longer story. And I'd encourage you to read these papers, and there are some newer papers, obviously, that are coming out. So what about bias? These results just show us what happens to efficiency. So take them at face value for a second to say that an algorithm is more efficient than the judge. Just believe me for a minute, if you will. And what about equity? That's the story I'm building up to. So here we built an algorithm. It does better than the judge, but how do we know it's not exaggerating inequity? After all, the society cares about the composition of who is jailed. So how do we examine bias? So here I'm going to show you this. Take this. This is what the judge does. This is their crime rate. This is the crime rate the algorithm results in. Now I'm moving down the curve. So holding constant release rates, I end up with lower crime. So that's the drop relative to the judge. So what about, so who ends up being detained? You'll notice the algorithm detains a hair more Black defendants. detains a hair less Hispanic defendants and is slightly more discriminatory, about the same. I think standard errors wise, you basically would say the algorithm is basically no more biased than the judge on average. Now, the key here that I want to point out is the judicial benchmark. When we think about a lot of these algorithms, I don't think most people would have said, let's see how the algorithm compares to what the judge is already doing. And I think that's a pretty big oversight, because at a minimum, we have to understand that we can't look at the algorithm in isolation. I mean, that's a useful data point, the algorithm in isolation, but it's also equally useful to say, what does it do relative to the judge? Now, of course, judges themselves may be very biased. So to say we built an algorithm and it comes out like the judge hardly is, you know, as David's work has shown, this is hardly awesome that we want to do this. So can we do better? Now, so first lesson I want to take is that we should benchmark algorithms in the absolute, not against, we should benchmark algorithms against judges or against the status quo, not in absolute terms. But let's come back to, can we do better? So here's a sense in which we can already do better in the previous algorithm I described. I went down the curve. I said, if we kept release rates constant, but notice the algorithm lets us also release a lot more people. So we could go across the curve. So there's a disparate benefit of the fact that the algorithm is simply more efficient and therefore can release a lot more people. Because guess what? If you release a lot more people, who does that benefit? It's the kinds of people who are in jail. And who are the kind, I just showed you the kinds of people who are in jail in the American system. It's minorities. So if you went across the curve, you'd see huge reductions of minorities in jail. I want to just pause on this because it's shocking to me how many conversations about algorithms talk about the relative equity margin, but forget that efficiency, that is simply doing less of a bad activity, keeping people in jail, has a huge benefit to those people. And in this case, if you were an African-American defendant and you were applied to the algorithm, the first order news for you is you're 40% less likely to be jailed. That's a huge effect for you. So I'm not saying it's the only effect, but we shouldn't overlook the level effects when we're focusing on relative equity, which is what most measures do. But I'm still beating around the bush. Is that all we can do? Well, let me point out that so far we've taken an algorithm built solely for efficiency, then looked at its racial bias. Well, if we have these racial bias preferences, but preferences for equity, shouldn't the algorithm be optimized for it? This is very common, I find, which is that like you built an algorithm for one purpose and you say, well, let's look at its equity properties. But if we're building an algorithm and we care about equity, we should build an algorithm that incorporates equity preferences. What kind of algorithm would an equitably minded social planner want to use? So here I'm going to contrast two planners, an efficient planner, I'm going to call them, that cares only about the outcome, an equitable planner that cares also about the racial distribution of who ends up in jail or who's hired. So these are two extremes of the distribution. Sorry, not extremes, but the equitable planner has some weight on equity. This should be called the dumb planner or something. They just don't care about equity at all. So that's the extreme case. Okay. So does the equitable planner want to use a different algorithm? Would we want to use an algorithm other than the one that converges to expectation of Y star given W, comma G? Now, what's funny, if you took the algorithmic bias literature on face value, is it is about how we might build algorithms to account for bias. But I'm sort of asking the question, would we build any differently? And for example, would we want to orthogonalize the inputs against W? Would we want to have some sort of fairness constraints and impose additionally on the estimator? Well, it turns out that the optimal algorithm by the social planner is very straightforward. If a planner with no equity preferences uses a prediction function theta of W and a threshold release rule, then an equitable planner should use that exact same theta of W. They should not use a different algorithm. They'll use a different threshold, but they shouldn't otherwise use a different algorithm. It's a very straightforward result to show. And the first instance of it is in this very nice paper by Corbett, Davies et al. But the way you can think about it is, take the groups separately. Within each group, you obviously want to rank within group efficiently. So what is equity? Equity is simply a between group issue. But that means if you're talking about between group, it just means you're moving the threshold around in a group specific threshold. A different way to say it is to say the algorithm that works with the data, you want the one that extracts all the information in the data. And that's the theta of W. If you have preferences, you want to impose them and how that information is impounded into your choice rule, that's the threshold choice rule. So this is by way of saying, as a stark result, you actually don't want to change the algorithm at all. You basically just want to change the threshold. So let's see what this does in practice. We take our original algorithm and then we say, let's actually equal release rate for all races. And you can see that if we do that, so we just set thresholds so that we get the same release rate for all races, we basically get, there you go, that's the equity, but you get basically the same welfare gain, not 24% drop in crime, but 23% drop in crime, which suggests that you can get a huge equity gain as well as basically the same efficiency gain. So some implications of this result is that since W have blah blah is that both the equitable and efficient planner should be allowed to use race if possible. We can increase efficiency and equity by allowing the algorithm to have access to the protected variable. This is kind of new results in algorithms, but in the econometrics literature on discrimination, this is hardly new, but it's quite counterintuitive to how you think about humans. When you're regulating humans, the thing you would do is don't let them look at the protected variable. But with algorithms, you actually want to give them access to the protected variable. In case you think this is bizarre, just think of the following trivial example. Suppose students have intrinsic talent that for a minute we'll assume is equal across race groups. And these students, their intrinsic talent determines college success. But Black students are less able to afford SAT prep. You're trying to, based on the SAT, make some predictions. Would you want to blind college success prediction to race? No, because two students who get a good SAT score, one of whom is Black, one of whom is white, the Black score has a lot more, the 1300 for Blacks has a lot more signal than for whites because they didn't have SAT prep available. So we know this, that the slope on the disadvantaged group should be very different, even in the simplest models. So this is just a very straightforward implications. And so what I want to end this piece on is to say, interestingly, solving algorithmic bias is not a problem of estimation. You can adjust it post-production, and that's true for a wide variety of biases in data. So if it's not a problem of estimation, what is it? It goes back to the first story I told. We should be focusing on problems of incentives and detection rather than construction. The problem is, how do we detect that an algorithm that's being deployed in the world actually is being formed correctly? How do we ensure the incentives of algorithm designers are properly aligned? The construction issues, I think, are relatively straightforward and secondary, but this is why I started my talk by saying there's a lot of work for economists to do. So let me go to my final story.
A quick question on what you just said about the algorithms and race.
Yeah.
So would there be an easy way for a regulator to test whether an algorithm is using race in a way that's going to increase equity versus a way that's going to increase discrimination? Like, is it as simple as, say, comparing it to the same algorithm but taking out race, or are there some subtle things that would happen in trying to do that sort of comparison?
Great question, Aislinn. So the paper that Ashish has goes exactly into this detail, which is what constitutes an appropriate test? And part of what you have to deal with is you don't want to just look literally as to whether the algorithm uses race. Part of what you want to do is you want to project down and look and see how does it correlate with race. So it ends up, ironically, looking somewhat like the statistical tests you create for people. Like many of the papers you have in these sessions, like, police stops, etc. But with one key huge advantage, which is what makes it much, much easier. You can run every possible counterfactual because the algorithm is a fixed object. So a way to think about it is, because you can run every possible counterfactual, it's a little involved, but quite doable. Great. So let me get to my final story. This story is on knee pain. I don't know if, I guess most of you look pretty young, probably you're not. This is not a thing you think a lot about, but it turns out that osteoarthritis is the most common disorder in the United States. And I had not known about this area until I started working on it, thanks to David Cutler. But It's so common, so it's like I've given some numbers here, but it's actually so common that a big fraction of people on disability insurance are on disability insurance because of knee or back pain. It's that big of a deal in the United States. Now, this is the paper by Emma that was in Nature Medicine just this year. And so what I want to talk to you about with knee pain is that there's a striking fact about knee pain, and actually about most pain, actually, which is that the disadvantaged experience it at much higher rates. So if you just look at data on knee pain, you'll find a huge race gap and a huge income gap, and a big race gap, a pretty big income gap, and a pretty big education gap. I'll explain what these numbers mean in just a second. Well, that begs the question, why is there a pain gap? There are kind of two obvious theories. One is, well, the disadvantaged experience more pain because their knees are in worse shape. So there's something wrong inside their knees. The second theory is there's something outside their knees. That is, there are non-knee related factors that for the same physical joint problem results in the disadvantage feeling more pain. So as an example, I often think of the psychology at play here, which is that all the other stress you have in your life might exaggerate the physical pain that you're feeling here to be bigger felt pain, but a bunch of theories I've written here. So inside their knees, outside their knees. So the way you would deal with this is very clear. You would condition on how bad the knees are. That's what we do. So on the x-axis is a clinical judgment based on the x-ray. It's called the KL grade of how bad the knee is. On the y-axis is the pain score as reported by patients. And you'll see, even after you condition on how bad the knee is, there's still a pretty big gap between, say, Black and other patients. Okay, so normally I think that's where the story would have ended. But let's just ask one more question. So even controlling for severity, we see a problem. And you can see it barely changes the pain gap. But does this really settle the matter? Medical knowledge is basically still in flux. It's why we're still doing the science. We don't really understand knee pain that well. It's not like KL grade explains pain all that well. So maybe there's something in the knees we don't know about. So it's possible that there's actually something in the knees that we don't know about that disproportionately afflicts the disadvantaged, and that's why we see the gap. So how would we evaluate this hypothesis? What's interesting is this story taught me a very different use of algorithms. So to look for overlooked physical features in the knee, which explain higher pain level in disadvantaged groups, well, we could use machine learning, but for discovery purposes. We could train a ComNet to take the images of x-rays. So it takes the input of the image and it outputs the pain score. Let me be very precise what it's predicting. It's not predicting what the physician thinks is the severity of the problem. Let me also tell you what the algorithm has access to. It only sees the x-ray. It doesn't know anything about your demographic. It knows nothing. It only knows the x-ray and the pain score. So for example, it's not given lab values or anything. And so that's the exercise. So that gives me a different measure of severity. When you use that measure of severity on the x-axis, the disparity completely disappears. Which suggests that the overlooked signal in the knee x-ray was there. The clinicians didn't actually find it, and it actually helps explain why the disadvantaged patients are experiencing more pain. Before you see the figure on the right, the common wisdom is, oh, well, we need to somehow do something very different with this low-income population because they experience worse pain. But in fact, I think what this work is showing is that no, it's just the clinical, the field of medicine had not noticed these factors in the x-ray and not learned about them, and it happens to implement. So let me just finish this story with pointing out something kind of, if I were to tell this as a story. Patients have been coming in and telling doctors, there's something, I'm feeling a lot of pain. The doctors have listened to this, looked at the x-ray and said, no, you're fine. And yet the algorithm is proving better at listening to the disadvantaged patients than the doctors themselves. And this is a sense in which properly targeted algorithms can be a force for equity. In this case, now we realize there is something that's missing. And we often talk about the data and the biases in our data. So let's think a little bit about what the biases were in the human data set that generated this. If you go back to the original data that created the clinical understanding of what causes knee pain, of course, it's evolved since then, but let's go back to the first data set that created it, the one that human scientists have used. It's noteworthy because Emma went back and said, let me look at what the distribution, the race distribution of patients was in the data. And she's looking for the table. And in fact, there is no such table. There's no table because the time this paper was written, it was just taken as self-evident that people equals white people. This was a study done in Britain. And of course, who would be in the data set? What is there but white people? What are we even talking about? So weirdly, it's one of those papers that it's old enough and at a time, and that is what the core of the clinical understanding is. It's no surprise that we have this gap. So let me conclude these three stories by talking about a few broader lessons. The trite point I want to make that underlies all of these is that algorithms themselves are simply a tool. Whether they promote equity or inequity depends on the motives of those using them. And I hope that's the image of kind of, it can go very bad, as you saw in the racial bias healthcare algorithm. That is 100 million patients who are really screwed at scale. It's not a good situation, but it could also go very well, as you saw in the last thing. It's really about the motives and the care with which people approach these problems. And the smaller points I want to make is that I think formal economic and econometric analysis has much to offer this area. And there's too little work done positing these problems in principal agent and other kinds of frameworks. Okay, let me stop right there and I can open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Sendhil. We really appreciate that. That was wonderful. So we have about 15 minutes for questions, which is awesome. So if you don't mind sticking around and answer and chatting with us, if you have a question, you want to raise your hand, I'll go ahead and call on you. So the first one is Peter. Want to unmute yourself?
Hey, thanks. That's a really thought-provoking overview. Thanks, Sendhil. I was curious after your second question, or your second story, I should say, when sort of the conclusion was like, for algorithms, we need to incorporate some information on race in order to sort of attain an equity goal. Does that make you rethink sort of the first story of thinking about these audit studies, which at best are going to capture sort of a notion of race blindness, that decision makers don't use race information at all? So if we want to align those things, does that mean that we sort of need to move beyond those sorts of audit studies to get at the algorithmic notion of fairness, or do we need to sort of come up with different notions? I know you've thought a lot about the different types of fairness.
What an awesome question, Peter. I don't like getting questions I haven't thought of, so I think you're losing points in my book. Hold on, let me just take a moment to write this down. I think if I were to answer this on the fly, I think what I would say is that the audit studies attempt to hold something like the Y star, the productivity relevant X is constant. To the degree they do that, we can question it. But in essence, they're not checking race blindness per se. They are trying to check something like the use of race when it is irrelevant for Y star. And I think that would still be a good test. Having said that, I think that's a narrow answer to, I think, a deeper point you're making, which I think is exactly right. And this is something that I think is exactly right. So let me say your point in a different way, which is I think what Ashish would say in his paper. When we think about disallowing race for human decision makers, that's a very blunt tool. And we do that because we can't verify the exact rules they use. And that sense in which I think is what you're saying is exactly right. I think it's exactly right. In fact, I think what comes out of that principal agent model that I had never really thought of is the notion of disparate treatment is almost a second best in an incentive world to say, I don't know if you're using race well or not, but you know what? I think that's at least one thing I can look at, and I'm going to block that out.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Jonah?
Hey, Jonah, it's been so long. Yeah, how are you?
Hey, Sendhil, I'm trying to remember the last time it was, but it's been a very long time. I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was really thought-provoking, and I love the range of things you talked about there. It's actually the last thing you said to Peter, in answer to Peter, is kind of a helpful frame, I think, in some respects for my question, which is we're in the middle of, if not a revolution, at least a kind of a mass transformation in the lower courts, and also to a large extent, I think right now the Supreme Court, where I think there's going to be tremendous hostility to race aware policies, like to explicitly race aware policies that are designed to remedy inequities. And we could talk about specific cases, but I'm sort of less interested in that than in the particular part of your presentation in which you were talking about the optimal use of algorithms by equity-oriented algorithmers. And so I think, I'm totally on board, use the same theta function, use a different threshold. I totally see the point. It seems obvious ex post, it's great. I suspect anything that clear is going to be held to be either unconstitutional or somehow to violate some aspect of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or subsequent ones. Maybe there will be carve-outs, but I'm pretty pessimistic about the ability to use those policies. So I'm wondering whether you think there's scope for, in a sense, doing the reverse of what we're usually looking to stop, which is to say, are there ways to sort of use equity promoting disparate, reverse engineering in some sense? Let me stop there because I think you get the point that I'm asking about.
Yeah, let me expand on what you're saying, Jonah. It's just like normally people are like, well, the algorithm doesn't have access to race, but maybe it used something else and it reconstructed race, it did other stuff. But you're pointing out, well, if we want to use race to promote equity and we're not allowed to, maybe all this reconstruction business is our friend. And I think that's exactly, I hadn't thought of that. I think that's a great way to go. I will just point out there is just another element, which is ultimately the laws. I agree with everything you said, and I think that's a great point, not something I've thought of. I will just add one thing to it though, which is, the ideas of today are actually just the consequences of whatever people pushed 20, 30 years ago. And I think we have a chance to lay the seeds for what the next generation of legal scholars is actually thinking about. And I think it's important that we call out the fact that things like race blindness is often viewed as the most equitable or efficient outcome. But in an inequitable world, the most efficient algorithm uses race. I mean, that is, and failing to use that is a cost in efficiency and equity. So in some sense, helping people see that race blindness is not a form of efficiency, that we don't add these things to terms when and I think even just opening the discussion, and I agree with you completely, it's not going to be implementable today, but I hope that as people can see the inequities in having these blinded rules, I think the inefficiencies, not just inequities, I hope that spurs debate down the road.
Can I just say one last thing in response? So I love that answer. I think it's really thoughtful. There is another version of it, which is, well, maybe we need to change the Civil Rights Act. The politics of that could be catastrophic for those who are interested in equity. And I'm not advocating it as such, but I do think it might be that, if 20 or 30 years is too long, even if it's possible, that might be a thing that has to be thought of. So anyway, I love your answer. Thank you.
And also, I just want to broaden it out. There are countries outside the United States. So all these issues are playing themselves out in every country around the world. And in those countries, I think there's actually more room to get stuff done as well. So totally agree with you. Thanks.
Cool. David?
Thanks. A couple questions. A comment, you probably know this, but there's a couple, I guess, field experiments, right, that make this point that when you remove access to race or gender information, you don't necessarily get what you expect, right? There's this Behaghel, Crépin, and Barbershon paper in the French Civil Service, and there's this very small study, actually, of hiring at a small labor economics institution in Bonn, Germany, that remains unidentified, where they blind the resumes, right, and find out, that they actually get fewer women hired out. So we have real world evidence this happens, and the explanation, certainly in the case of the other paper, is sort of you're trying to do something like affirmative action, and now you can't, right? And then obviously, should we have been doing it in the first place depends on kind of your example about the Blacks who have less access to the SAT scores, where we clearly it would be efficient to use it. The question I'm going to ask was If you know anything, or anyone else does, and maybe Jonah does, I don't know if everyone else in this room, about the legal issues involved. I mean, I do a lot of recently expert witness work on discrimination cases, and plaintiffs' attorneys talk a lot about these algorithms, but it's not clear they would ever get access to it. Now, you've gotten access in some interesting cases, presumably somebody who at least wasn't thinking yet about getting sued for using it. Do we know anything about, what courts have said about what's proprietary and what's not, and what you can be held liable for if you're using an algorithm? If the courts could discover, let's say in the hiring context where we have a clear law, that you were getting discriminatory outcomes from that?
So this is really one of those areas where the law is basically being made as we speak through case law and through some states passing, like New York is trying to do something active on this. There's a few other states that are very active on this. And I think this is a place where economists have an enormous chance to contribute, because one thing that you're seeing is that the first draft of these bills is pretty bad, like really quite bad. But I think there's some people trying to work to make them better. So for example, the better drafts I've seen are exactly like you're alluding to, David. One, I mean, even though, as you say, firms hide behind the idea these algorithms are proprietary. I mean, we do discovery for all sorts of things, so the analogy I've used is, in the world of accounting and finance, there's no notion of like, well, my trading rules are proprietary. It's like, look, there's disclosure there's certain things you disclose just to the SEC. There are other things that you don't disclose. We have elaborate disclosure regimes that trade off various things, and we've gotten good at that. And similarly, we just need a disclosure regime and a set of disclosure laws. Now, disclosure doesn't mean disclosure to the public. Disclosure could mean under discovery to a regulator, to a set of people. And so my understanding, because these laws are being written now and judges are ruling on them, is it's really just the case laws just being decided upon right now. And I'd love to hear what people ask about your second question, which is the liability thing. The things I've seen involve there being no shield that like, hey, I was just using an algorithm, but I actually, it's very few instances I've seen, and I'd actually be curious if the use of an algorithm creates some artificial sort of shield against behavior, or that was your choice, if anyone knows. And those two studies, by the way, David, they're terrific. I should have mentioned them in the talk. It's totally right.
Any more questions?
I've sort of a vague pair of questions / observations of just thinking about like what happens in the long term as we use these algorithms more. So one quick intuition that I'm curious how it maps to what you're doing is like, so the more you use the GRE for grad school admissions, the less correlated it becomes with success. And so like I kind of wonder if there are issues like that here too, where when you start using the algorithm, it's going to like then depend, that's going to change the partial correlations that you see in the data. So I guess that's like that's my relatively concrete long-term question. I mean, and like the other one is this might be what you're getting at with the principal agent point. I mean, it just seems like a key difference between these algorithmic and human decision-making is that it's like easier to critique the algorithm in some sense, and that like once you start plopping this into an arena with political constraints, I don't know. I guess you can see things that being good or bad. Like I was thinking it was good, and then I heard Jonah's question, and now I'm worried it's bad. So yeah.
So let me start with the last one and sort of come back to. So it's a good way to think about the principal agent framework is that it's kind of my answer to Aislin's question as well, is that the decision rule is committed because the algorithm makes a prediction rule, and then the prediction rule is committed. Whereas the decision maker in typical things, when it's a person, they don't have to commit to the rule publicly. They can just make choices at the margin and just leave this. That you're completely right. And the thing you're described as, is that good or bad? It's a great question, because it's one of the places where in a discourse sense, it can be bad, and it's worth describing, is when we have a lot of tacit preferences that we don't want described explicitly. And I've not seen work on this, but I think it is definitely a problem that algorithms pose for society. They force us to be explicit as a collective on dimensions that we may not want to be explicit as a collective. So for example, if you're an equitably minded admissions person, it's easy for you to implement your equity preferences without ever talking to anybody, telling anybody. You just kind of do it. It's the flip side of it. But of course, the flip side of it is if you're a prejudiced admissions officer, you're free to. So it goes both ways, but it's neither good nor bad. So I think that's exactly right. I at least the second question I have an answer for. For the first one of the active areas of research in this area is what do you do when the characteristics, the X's or W's, are manipulatable by individuals? And so then we're back to the usual thing of, do individuals respond to the algorithm you put in place and respond? Again, that's an area that is pretty core to economics. And so I think we should have a lot to add to that. So I think Jonah put some papers in the chat that is in response to your question, David, a little bit.
Conrad has a question.
Sendhil, I was wondering, this is a pretty narrow question. You mentioned the selective labels problem, and I was wondering if you knew of some good examples where that turned out to be quantitatively important.
So we have a paper in Health that, let me see if I can give a brief description so I don't bore people. But basically, we run the same playbook, but this time it's a doctor deciding whether to test for heart attack. You want to test. This is the other one. You want to test if risk of heart attack is above some threshold, but not if it's below some threshold. We want to then ask, is the doctor testing efficiently? And what we find is, contrary to sort of moral hazard theories of over-testing, the doctor screws up on both margins. They test a bunch of patients who basically have zero risk, which to verify that fact doesn't require selective labels, because the algorithm identifies some patients. You say this is zero risk, and you have their labels, you have the test outcome. But we also find a set of patients that look incredibly high risk to the algorithm that the doctor just does nothing about. But of course, that has a selective labels problem. There we find the naive estimates without accounting for selective labels is way off, like way off. And in part because the private information there, the private information in the judge case is they probably have a little bit, but it's a little notional. Here, the private information is like, what does the patient look like? What they exactly see? A lot of these health records, they don't even have ECG, which is the waveform. So we actually show, so that case is riddled with selective labels. And in fact, when we do what we think of as the best estimate, like the under testing we find, accounting for all that is like 1/4 of what you find if you just took the whole thing naively. The naive estimate just looks ridiculous, and it is ridiculous. So that's one place I know of. I'm sure there are others that people have found, and people on the Zoom might know others.
Thank you.
Okay, that's right on time. So thanks, Sendhil. This was wonderful. Thanks so much for coming and the wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone who came today, and all the wonderful papers and discussion. This was great. So we're gonna start it up again tomorrow, same time. All the links are online, and yeah, see you tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone.